Hello, Karina Essa here from Think Smart Education, and my special guest today is Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff is an economist, he's a financial commentator, a financial broker, an author, and also the host of the Peter Schiff Show. Peter, welcome. Now, I wanted to discuss, you predicted a stock market crash, a big one as well. And that's one of the main things you agreed with Harry Dent, and it hasn't happened yet. So how can you explain that? Is it coming?
Well, I think in real terms, which means stock prices, now talk about US stock market, in terms of gold, I think we're going to see a significant decline, whether you want to call it a crash or not, in US stocks. There's just no doubt in my mind that that's going to happen. But as far as the US dollar price, it's difficult to forecast because it's a moving target, because the dollar could crash. In fact, the dollar should crash and probably will crash. And so when the dollar crashes, stock prices expressed in dollars may not go down. They may actually go up, but they may not go up enough to offset the declining value of the dollar. So it's that the dollar could end up falling more than stocks. But you can see what's really happening through gold. So if the dollar goes down, and the stock market in dollar terms doesn't go down, it may be going down dramatically in gold terms. And I think that is going to happen. And you know, the US stock market is very overpriced, and it should crash, especially if investors came to terms with the economic reality, which is that the days of low inflation are gone forever. They were the aberration. That high inflation is here to stay. It's going to get worse. There's nothing that the Fed is going to be able to do to bring it back down to the levels that the markets got used to over the past decade or so. And when the markets have to start pricing that in, which is higher inflation, higher interest rates, valuations are going to have to, come down significantly to bring the market in line with that reality, especially in the bond market. If you look at the long end of the bond market, yields are still only about 4% for 10 and 30-year treasuries. They should be 2 or 3 times that much. And when bonds are repriced to reflect that, the stock market has to collapse. Again, the only thing that's going to prevent it is a dollar crash that makes it harder to recognize how much value stocks have lost.
And what do you think will really trigger that crash?
I don't know. I mean, it's a big bubble, so a lot of things could end up being the pin. But I do think that it'll probably show up in the dollar first and in the gold market. So a big crack in the dollar. Dollar index right now is around 100. There's some support around 90. And I expect the dollar to fall to around 90 without a lot of concern in the markets. But I do think that bond prices will fall, oil prices will rise, the gold price will rise. But I think once the dollar takes out that level and heads for the record lows, which are around 70 on that index, and that's the level the dollar bottomed out in 2008. It was actually kind of ironically saved by the financial crisis. But when we take out that level, I would expect a dollar crisis, and a much bigger move. And that should, bring down the markets. In fact, it was the weakness in the dollar and the impact it had on the bond market that really sparked the 1987 stock market crash. But up until 87, the dollar had been falling, bonds had been falling, and the stock market kept going up. It kept ignoring what was happening. And what was weighing on the bond market were the twin deficits, budget deficits and trade deficits that were rising. And that was putting pressure on the dollar, which was pushing bond prices down, yields up, and eventually the stock market cracked. The same thing is really happening, or will be happening, where we have record budget deficits, record trade deficits, much bigger than what we had in the mid 80s. I think it is going to weigh down the dollar and the bond market, and then eventually the stock market.
Now, you talked about the twin deficits, and something that I think only you talks about as much. So why is that? Why isn't anyone talking about twin deficits?
Well, no one really talks about any of the deficits. They just don't think they matter. And I think it's because people were talking about the deficits in the 80s and the 90s and warning about, the catastrophic consequences of continuing down that fiscal path. And nothing's happened as far as everybody's concerned. The bubble just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think it's lulled everybody into a false sense of complacency that these deficits don't matter. They do matter. But they haven't mattered to the financial markets yet. But they will. We've been able to continue to go deeper and deeper into debt. I mean, the world is history with examples where problems don't matter until they matter. At some point, you reach the breaking point where it's like one more straw, breaks the camel's back. You don't know how many straws can go on there until the final one, and then you find out. So it is going to be a problem. I don't know where it is. I mean, right now, the national debt is 32 trillion. Where does it break? Is it 33 trillion? Is it 40 trillion? Is it 50 trillion? I don't know. It's somewhere. The trade deficits are over $1 trillion a year. Can they get to $2 trillion a year? I mean, I don't know. I don't know where it comes, but it's both of them combined have to be financed. But what's different now is that you actually have an active movement to de-dollarize. You have major creditors of the United States around the world actively seeking to circumvent dollars, to structure bilateral trade deals in other currencies. In fact, the BRIC nations are now discussing launching a new currency that they will use for trade that will be backed by gold, real legitimate currency backed by real money. You have the example recently of the sanctions against Russia following the invasion of the Ukraine, and the warning that sends to the world that you better get away from the dollar, that as long as you are part of this dollar system, you are beholden to the United States. The United States can punish you at will through sanctions. Now, a lot of countries don't want to give up that type of sovereignty, and so they're moving away from the dollar. So you don't have the ability, the way we have in the past, to just export all this inflation to get away with these massive deficits, because the Chinese, the Saudis, the Russians, the Japanese, everybody's just going to keep buying our dollars, and particularly all the emerging markets in Asia or Latin America, that they're going to absorb these dollars. They're just not going to do it. So we've got to be very close to the bottom dropping out of this market.
And let's say it doesn't happen. Then what's the other likely scenario? Could the stock market go sideways for a while?
Let's say what doesn't happen?
Well, the dollar doesn't crash. The stock market doesn't crash.
If the dollar doesn't crash now, it just crashes later, because as long as the dollar doesn't crash, the deficits will continue to grow. And so that guarantees that there's eventually going to be a crash, because the deficits can't grow forever. And so the longer we succeed in kicking the can down the road, the bigger the problem gets. The one thing I know for sure is that American politicians are never going to act preemptively to avert that crisis, because why should they? As long as there isn't a crisis, then they have no reason to do anything, because all the politicians care about is getting reelected. And you don't get reelected by dealing with a problem like this, because in order to deal with the debt problem and to try to prevent a crisis, you have to create a political crisis right now. You have to create a depression, because the government has to significantly cut spending. And that means a lot of voters aren't going to get the money that they were promised. And so they're not going to reelect the people who broke the promise. In order to do the right thing, interest rates have to go way up, which means asset prices have to come way down, which means a lot of people lose a lot of money, including voters. They also end up losing their jobs as companies that were kept afloat by cheap money sink and they go bankrupt. So a lot of bad things have to happen to prevent an even worse thing from happening later. Well, the politicians never want to do that. And they would rather have a more severe crisis later than a less severe crisis sooner, because the sooner crisis means that they don't get reelected. A later crisis means that they may not even be office, because who knows, maybe it won't be another 10 years. Maybe they'll be retired by then or whatever. So it's always about postponing the pain. So it's inevitable that we have to deal with the pain. So the sooner it happens, actually, the better, because the longer we have to wait, the worse it's going to be.
I know it's hard to get timing right, but in your opinion, when do you think that will happen?
Well, again, as you said, I don't know. I mean, I'm already, I don't know if it's surprise is the word at this point, but it should have happened a long time ago. So we could have had this interview 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and I would have been saying the same things, that the dollar is going to have to crash for many of the reasons that I'm saying now. It's just that all the problems that I would have discussed a decade ago have gotten so much worse. Yet we still haven't had the crisis yet. So we're definitely closer to it now. We have to be than we were back then. But if we could go that long, who's to say we couldn't do it another 10 or 20 years? Now, to me, it seems impossible, because if this is going to go on for another 10 or 20 years, that means the national debt's going to probably get to 100 trillion. The numbers are just too enormous to fathom that the world could finance this, that it could bear such a heavy burden. Because if we're going to borrow that much, that means the rest of the world has to lend that much to us. And if we're going to live that far beyond our means, the rest of the world has to accept a huge decline in their own living standards to make that possible. I just don't see that. I mean, the trade deficits could move, to several $trillion a year. I mean, we could get to the point where Americans produce absolutely nothing, where the world just supplies us with everything. And obviously, we're not going to get there. I mean, there has to be a break, somewhere. And to me, as I said, there's already enough evidence, of all the cracks in the dam that it's going to give way.
The 4 banks collapsing this year, was that a first crack? It reminded us a lot of the 2008 crisis, like what happened to Lehman Brothers. You had predicted the 2008 crash. So did the 4 banks collapsing for you make you believe that we were getting very close?
Yeah, well, first of all, I predicted the collapse of those banks as well. I didn't predict it by name. But years ago, when the Fed had lowered interest rates and held them there, I predicted that when rates eventually rose, that banks would start to fail because of their balance sheets. I specifically warned that banks were loading up on long-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, and that when interest rates finally rose, these portfolios would be underwater, and that when the deposit rates rose, when rates went up and they had to pay their depositors more interest, that they would be unable to do that because they had already locked up all the deposits in low-yielding long-term debt. And that's exactly what happened. And in fact, when a lot of people in finance, when they were talking about rising rates, they said that was going to be positive for financials because they said they're going to do better in a higher rate environment. And I constantly corrected that view by saying, no, this is going to destroy the financials because of their balance sheets. What's going to happen to the value of their assets when rates go up? And everybody always wanted to talk about how great it was that Americans were able to refinance their mortgages, and now everybody has a 30-year mortgage at 3 to 4%, and this was great for the borrower. And I would always point out, sure, but at whose expense? It's good for the borrower, it's lousy for the lender, because when interest rates finally go up, the lenders are broke who are holding this paper, and the lenders are the banks. And also, the government that has guaranteed a lot of these loans. So I wasn't investing in financials. If you look at the portfolios that I managed, we had very little to zero allocation to financials, very overweight, and the financials got killed in 2022. That's one of the reasons that my performance was so good in 2022. I think my dividend payers fund was ranked number 1 out of the 350 global value funds tracked by Morningstar and Lipper, precisely because we didn't have the financials, and so we avoided that carnage. Same thing. Also, tech went down a lot. We were underweight there, but had the government not backstopped the banks following those failures, we would have already had a much bigger financial crisis than 2008. And so, but that government backstop didn't solve the problem. Again, it just delayed the consequences of the problem, because the banks that failed were not the exception. They're pretty much the rule. They were just more leveraged than the ones that hadn't failed. It was just the tip of an iceberg. But the entire banking sector in the U.S. has the same problem that Silicon Valley Bank had or Signature Bank had. It's just that the government backstopped those banks before they had an opportunity to fail. It's just like when the mortgage crisis hit in 2007. It started in subprime. And when it initially reared its head, the Federal Reserve, a lot of other prominent people said, okay, don't worry about it. It's contained. That was their word. It's contained to subprime. And what I was saying at the time was, no, the problem is not contained. It's just subprime is where the problem is the greatest. That's the weakest link in a chain, so it gave way first. But I said the entire mortgage market has the problem, but subprime collapsed first because it had it to a bigger degree. And of course, it turned out that I was right. It wasn't contained at all. And that's the same thing today. They're trying to dismiss it. Oh, it's just these loan banks. They had incompetent management. It wasn't the incompetent management. I mean, maybe they were incompetent, but so is everybody else. But it was the Federal Reserve that created this situation by keeping interest rates so low for so long, and U.S. regulators for steering the banks into these risky securities, guaranteeing all the deposits so the depositors didn't pull their money out, and giving the banks favorable accounting treatment so long as they bought government guaranteed obligations, whether it was treasuries or mortgages. The regulators told the banks, you don't have to recognize any of your losses on this paper. You can just, mark it to maturity and not have to mark it down based on the market loss, based on rising interest rates or any of that. So the banks were just ignoring these losses. They became a problem when their depositors needed their money because the money wasn't there. And in order to get the money, they had to sell these securities at huge losses. That's where the banks initially said, hey, they needed to raise capital because they needed investors to put more money in so the depositors could get their money out. That was the irony of what happened to my bank, because while the governments were bailing out insolvent banks, they shut down my bank, even though my bank was probably the only solvent bank around, because we didn't have any loans. All of our money was in cash. So all of my customers could have withdrawn 100% of their deposits on the same day, and I had it. I could have sent it out. But they ended up closing my bank under the pretense of it being insolvent, even though it was probably the most solvent bank in existence. And while the customers of all these insolvent banks never lost access to their money, my customers have had no access to their money in over a year, even though all the money is sitting there, because it's now under control of government and the government won't let them get it back. My bank was one of the only banks that really could have survived without a government bailout, because we didn't own any long-term bonds, because we didn't make any loans at all. That's one of the reasons that people put their money in my bank, was because I promised not to loan it out. I didn't want to expose the deposits to risk. All these other banks that had government guarantees took tremendous risk. And these customers aren't losing any money because the governments are bailing out these banks.
Do you believe more banks will collapse, that the 4 banks collapsing is just the beginning?
Well, I think that if it wasn't for the government backstops, we already would have seen tremendous failures. In fact, I think the entire U.S. banking system is insolvent, including the too big to fail banks. You know, the Bank of America, the J.P. Morgans, the Citis. These banks are insolvent too. They couldn't survive without government backstops. In fact, if the government said, hey, there's no more deposit insurance, there'd be runs on these banks because they all have these same underwater portfolios. The only reason these banks may not fail is because the dollar fails instead, which means that if you are a depositor at a U.S. bank, you are guaranteed to lose, right? Because there's only 2 possible scenarios. One is that your bank fails because the government stops backstopping it. So your bank fails and you lose money. Even the insured depositors will lose because the FDIC does not have the resources to cover these deposits. I mean, last time they bailed out the uninsured deposits. Right? But if the Fed is not backstopped, then everybody's going to lose. Alternatively, if the Fed bails everybody out and doesn't let anybody lose, the only way they can do that is by creating massive inflation. They're going to have to print up all the money these banks have lost. And so you won't lose your deposits, but your deposits will lose their purchasing power. So yes, if you had $1 million in the bank, you still have $1 million in the bank. The problem is when you take that $1 million to the grocery store, you're not going to be able to buy a lot of food with it. Right? That's going to be the problem. You're not going to have your purchasing power. So you're going to lose either way. You're going to lose purchasing power because you lose your money, or you're going to lose purchasing power because your money loses its value. That's why I tell people in America, take your money out of the banks. You can't leave it there. I mean, you could leave money in your checking account to pay your rent, but don't leave any long-term savings in a bank. You're guaranteed to lose. You got to withdraw it and do something else with it. So you can have gold and silver and store that, or you can make investments. You could buy income producing stocks, which is what we do, a lot of portfolios of value stocks around the world. You could buy rental property. You have to own real things. What you can't own is just paper. You can't own U.S. currency in a bank. You can't be a creditor. You can't have a bond where you're going to be paid dollars in the future, because even if the borrower pays you back, the money that you get isn't going to buy very much. I think in order for the world to kind of re-embrace gold as a monetary instrument again, as a unit of account, as a medium of exchange, and not simply as a store of value, you don't have to take physical possession of your gold. You don't have to physically use your gold in commerce. If I want to buy something from you and pay in gold, I don't have to give you a gold coin or a gold bar. What we can do is we can have gold stored by a reliable third party, and that third party can issue evidence of ownership, which can be in a digital form, whether as like a cryptocurrency or just within a closed loop kind of system, where there's some representation of that ownership that I can transfer to you instead of the physical gold. So the gold stays in one place, and I transfer my ownership of that gold to you. And when you do that, you can now transfer ownership of a tiny fraction of your gold. So I could buy, a cup of coffee from you if you're selling coffee, and I can pay for that in gold, and you can receive that payment instantly, inexpensively. So that's how we can all transact in gold without physically having to, deliver the gold in a physical sense. The gold can just stay put in a safe environment, and we could trade with each other using the evidence of ownership, because that's initially where paper money came from. It was a more convenient way to transact in gold. The gold sat with a goldsmith in a warehouse, and you had a warehouse receipt for that gold, which became currency. And so instead of going back to the goldsmith and getting the gold every time we want to do a transaction, we just transferred the piece of paper, and whoever had that piece of paper owned the gold, could go and take the gold whenever they want. The same thing would happen in a digital world. Whoever has the digital token that represents that gold can go to the custodian and say, I'd like my gold, and claim the physical gold. But there's no reason to do that, because you don't actually need the gold unless you're a jeweler, or unless you're manufacturing computer chips, or unless you're doing something where you actually need the physical gold. If the only reason you want the gold is to use it as a store of value or of a medium of exchange, you don't need the gold. If you're a jeweler and you're trying to make a bracelet, then you need the gold.
And apart from investing in gold and silver, what other safe haven assets would you recommend people?
Well, as I said, we're buying a lot of stocks. I think that the emerging market equities probably, to me, have the most upside as far as a regular type of businesses, because I think that as the dollar falls, it's the emerging market currencies that have the most upside potential, and therefore the greatest amount of rise in their living standards. I think you're going to see a lot of wealth, all of a sudden appearing in those economies as they're relieved of the burden of having to prop up the U.S. and now more of their production is consumed domestically. More of their savings go into financing productive activity at home rather than enabling profligacy in the United States through government spending and consumer spending. So I think a lot of those equities have the most potential, but I also think the equities that are related to commodities, which I think will be a main beneficiary of inflation and a weak dollar. So that would be energy sector, agriculture, metals, mining. Particularly I think if I'm right about a remonetization of gold, then the precious metals mining stocks have the most upside potential. In a world where gold is money again, it's not 1,900 an ounce, which is where it is now, or 1,950. It's much, much higher than that.
How much higher do you think gold could go?
10,000, 20,000. I don't know where gold has to be, because again, it's a moving target. The longer we wait to remonetize it, the higher the price it's going to take to get it done, because we keep creating more and more paper. So the price has to be much higher. And none of this is incorporated into these gold stocks. Again, everybody expects the Fed to succeed in bringing inflation back down to 2%. It's not going to succeed. It's going to fail miserably. And in fact, even when it was below 2%, it never really was. I mean, that was because the measuring tools, the CPI, was flawed. It's not picking up all of the price increases.
Talking about inflation, the Fed is trying to fight inflation, but at the same time, the U.S. is sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. So how does that work, and how can they justify what they're doing?
Well, I mean, they try to say they're trying to, keep, I guess, democracy safe, or we're fighting for Ukrainian freedom or independence. They say that if we don't, stop Putin here, he's going to be marching throughout the rest of Europe. I mean, it's just all a bunch of nonsense. They're creating a pretense again to fund this war. But yes, we don't have the money. I mean, we're borrowing the money from the Chinese to give it to the Ukrainians in order to perpetuate a war that, absent all this money, there would have been a peace a long time ago. There would have been a deal between Russia and the Ukraine. And I don't think that it's an issue or ever has been about freedom in the Ukraine. It's you could say it's about independence, but it wasn't like they were that free before the war. In fact, if you go to look at the heritage ranking of economic freedom, Ukraine ranked lower than Russia before the war. So there was already less freedom in the Ukraine than there was in Russia. And since the war started, they've even cracked down more. So the Ukraine is a lot less free today than it was before the war. So, I mean, would it really be worse if there was some kind of deal with Russia? No, I don't think so. We're not, Zelensky is not George Washington, right? This is not, the equivalent. And Putin is not Adolf Hitler. I mean, they're trying to make these extremes in the media to justify what's going on. But, as the war now, I mean, it's well over 500 days old. I mean, at some point, the public is going to get tired of this. And ultimately, of course, it's the Ukrainians and the Russians that are paying the biggest price because they're the ones that are dying. We're just going into debt to finance it, but, we haven't spilled any blood. But I think a lot of that Ukrainian and Russian blood is on our hands for perpetuating a war when diplomacy and peace was a much better solution and could have been accomplished. But yeah, all of this is weighing on the finances, but it's also a distraction, right? I mean, public's attention can be misdirected to that war instead of focusing on a lot of the other domestic concerns.
Well, why are you thinking they're using it as a distraction from what exactly do you think?
Well, I mean, just the economy is, getting a lot worse, government debt, the banking crisis that is evolving. I mean, there are a lot of problems. And the war in Ukraine, I mean, not only can be a distraction, but it can be a scapegoat. And in fact, a lot of stuff, if you remember when inflation was first rearing its head, they wanted to blame it on Putin. And a lot of that had to do with the war. And it was Putin's price hikes and Putin this and Putin that. And so it's a convenient scapegoat for politicians, probably not just in the United States, but around the world, to blame a lot of things that are happening on the war, rather than accepting responsibility.
There's a lot of people who believe that the business of America is the business of war, and there's a lot of money to be made when they go to war. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are a lot of defense contractors that make a lot of money, and they donate a lot of money to the politicians to keep the war machine going, the military-industrial complex. Look, the same thing happens with the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, how much money did they make off of all the COVID, vaccines and things like that? So, industries, are in bed with government, and they bribe politicians to do things that they benefit from, which is the main reason that governments are not supposed to have all this power, because they're always going to be corrupted. And you're going to find people that say, oh, see, capitalism is bad because you have these big companies that are, working with government, bribing government. That's not capitalism's fault. That's government's fault for having all the power that businesses are, weaponizing to their advantage. But the problem is that we have a powerful government that is capable of auctioning off that power to the highest bidder. And this type of economic situation where you have kind of like the marriage between business and government, that's fascism. That's what it's called. And it's a socialist form of government. Fascism, like communism, are forms of socialism. They're different, but they're both forms of the same type of totalitarian government. We don't want fascism or communism. I don't want any type of socialism. I want freedom, right? And in a free economy where you don't have any of this stuff because the government is small. The government doesn't have the ability to tax and regulate to the degree that it does today. And so there's no way that a private business can utilize government in the way that it's doing now, because the government just doesn't have the power to sell.
And how do you think the war in Ukraine, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will unfold? Some people believe it's the beginning of World War III. Some people believe it's a threat. There might be nuclear war. I know that Donald Trump has talked about nuclear war quite a bit. What do you believe?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about it. I hope that that's not the case. I hope that it doesn't lead to a nuclear war. Obviously, the odds of that are not zero, which is another reason that we should not even have the war. I mean, why even risk something like that? For what reason? What is the compelling interest in this conflict that makes it worth the risk? Right? Even if the risk is small, why take the risk at all? I mean, for what reward? I mean, what is the upside? I don't see any upside. I also think that at the end of the day, we're not going to win, in that the Ukraine is not going to win this war. That whatever objectives we have will not be met in the Ukraine. Now, I don't think that Putin actually has an agenda beyond the Ukraine. I don't think it's like, well, if this domino falls, then the rest of them are going to go. No, I don't think that is the case at all. So I don't think that there's going to be any dire consequences for the rest of the world if there's an eventual peace between Russia and the Ukraine that involves the Ukraine staying out of NATO, that involves some territories, being ceded to Russia. In fact, personally, I mean, we shouldn't even have NATO. NATO should have been dismantled in the early 1990s. I mean, talk about a government organization that has outlived its purpose. The Warsaw Pact is gone. The sole purpose for NATO was to combat the Warsaw Pact. Well, when that pact dissolves, then you don't need NATO. NATO should have been dismantled. But the problem is the politicians like NATO. They made a lot of money off of NATO, and they didn't want to give that up. People that were employed didn't want to give up the perks and the prestige and the lifestyle. And the crazy thing about it is that NATO is expanded, that it's bigger now than it was when we actually had an enemy. It's like these, I forget who said it, that there's nothing with a longer life than a temporary government program. Because you would have thought that, okay, NATO was temporary, we just needed it so long as we had the Warsaw Pact that we needed to contain. But it's gone. Like in America, we had a lot of taxes that we introduced in the 40s. They were part of the victory tax to win the Second World War. Well, we won that war in 1945, but all the taxes that we created to pay to fight the war, we still have them. Right? The war ended a long time ago, but the taxes continued. So things never go away. There were a lot of programs that came in during the Depression. The Depression ended a long time ago, but all those programs are still there. What do we need them? So they never go away. So that's the same thing with NATO. NATO is here, and it's part of the problem. Because one of the main reasons for the Russia-Ukraine conflict was the idea that the Ukraine was going to join NATO. If there was no NATO to join, then it never would have been a concern of Russia. And so that we wouldn't be having this war.
I see. Since we're talking about this, I want to talk also about the U.S. elections coming up. And your U.S. president has arrested his political opponents. So I'd love to hear your views about how that's all unfolding.
Yeah, look, I think that this is all political. I don't think that Trump has criminal liability for his behavior. I don't think, what he's done is, with respect to these records, is any more egregious than what prior presidents may have done, and nobody even considered it a crime. I don't think anybody was harmed to the extent that Trump had some classified documents. I don't think he shared them with some foreign power and that anything was actually used to undermine the United States. I don't think that January 6th amounted to insurrection. I think it was a protest. The protesters were not armed. They didn't try to overthrow anything. They had their phones. They were taking selfies. They weren't firing shots. The only shots fired were from the Capitol Police, who basically escorted the protesters into the Capitol and made them believe that everything they were doing was fine. And the only person that was shot was a protester who was shot in the back by an armed policeman who was never charged with anything. So I think that you have a right to protest the result of an election. If you don't think it was fair, then protest it. I mean, you can't have a free election if you can't complain about the outcome. If you think it was rigged, then say it.
Do you think it was rigged?
I don't know if it was rigged or not. But I mean, it doesn't surprise me that Biden would win the election. I mean, generally the worst candidate wins. That's the problem with democracy. People, vote in the worst candidate. So, and I think that Biden was, worse than Trump, and so the electorate, elected him. But I don't know. I mean, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I think it's immaterial as far as these charges. I think you have a right to protest. But I think if you compare what Trump has been accused of to what it's obvious the Bidens actually did, if you look at all the evidence that has come forward, not only that Hunter Biden committed crimes, but that his father was involved in those crimes. You have Joe Biden, while a sitting vice president, who was taking bribe money, and actually using his power and his influence as vice president to help foreign powers in the Ukrainian companies. So they were taking bribes. They sold out the country. They sold out their office. I mean, these are real serious felonies that have been committed by a sitting president. I don't know, and nothing happened.
Do you believe Joe Biden is running again for president? Do you believe he's fit? A lot of the people around the world say that he isn't. Do you believe he's fit to run again?
Well, I mean, I think he's a criminal. I think that the fact that he's maybe senile is probably a positive, because he would probably be able to do more damage if he was in better control of his faculties. But the question is, who's manipulating him behind the scenes? But it's not just that Hunter was the criminal. It was Joe Biden. I mean, he was at the top of it. He's, the godfather of this mafia crime family, the Bidens. I mean, there were so many different Bidens on the payroll, and they had so many different shell companies that they were laundering all this money through. I mean, this the irony. I mean, accusing me of laundering money. It was the Bidens. They were involved in a massive money laundering operation. Because all this money, they couldn't admit the source of it. So they had to launder it through all of these shell companies that the Bidens created, especially to launder all this dirty money. I mean, and Biden's been in politics pretty much his entire life, because long before he was vice president, he was a U.S. senator, and he was in the Senate for a long time. And so he's probably been doing this for a long time. He's been using his power and influence, right, to make a tremendous amount of money illegally. And these are serious crimes, unlike what Trump is being accused of. I mean, these are trumped up charges against Trump. But meanwhile, they're ignoring the actual evidence of serious criminal behavior on the part of the Bidens. I could only imagine if the media was in possession of similar evidence against the Trump family. I mean, what would be going on? But you have a complicit media that kind of works with the government. Again, this is all elements of kind of like a fascist state where the government and the media are partnering together instead of the media being the watchdog of government. That's what they should be doing, is reporting on the illegal activity of government. No, they cover that up. But the media doesn't call this out. The media covers it up. The media is there to protect the government when it breaks the law. And it's not doing or performing the role that the media is there to perform. And that's why we have freedom of the press. Freedom of the press to criticize government, right? To shine a light on government when government breaks the law. The press is not there to protect the government when it breaks the law, but that's what it's doing.
They are rolling out CBDCs. It looks like many countries are doing that. Is it something that scares you?
Well, I think it's going to be a net negative for economic freedom because it just means more government control. And it means that there's less privacy because the government knows everything that you buy and everybody that you do business with. And, while that may make it harder for criminals, it's not worth the trade-off. That's one of the things that the 60 Minutes people tried to use against me in my trial. They said, like, they used one of my quotes from one of my podcasts where I said that I'm opposed to a lot of the AML laws out there because I think they're unconstitutional. I think that they, cause Americans to surrender very important constitutional rights. And I said that I don't think, or I said I think that it's more important, or I said that the government getting a few more tax evaders is not worth every American having to surrender their constitutional rights, that it's just not a good trade-off. And 60 Minutes said, you see, this means that he's in favor of criminals because he doesn't want every American to give up their constitutional rights. And even the judge in my case, Judge Jackman, who happens to be the brother of actor Hugh Jackman, so people know who he is, but he said, wait a minute, this does not mean what you're saying it means. He's not saying that he's in favor of criminals. He just doesn't want every single American to have to give up their constitutional rights in order for the government to get a few more tax evaders. I mean, there's 300 million Americans, right? Because basically what I said, and it's better for 10 guilty people to go free than one innocent man go to jail. I mean, that is the whole basis for the legal system, trial by jury, and the rules of law is we want to protect the innocent. And we're willing to allow some guilty people to go free to make sure that we don't punish somebody who was innocent. But 60 Minutes Australia actually has the opposite view. What they believe is that in order to get that one guilty person, we should put 10 innocent people in jail. They don't care about the innocent. They are so determined to get the guilty that it doesn't matter how many innocent people have to suffer to make sure that one guilty person doesn't get away with it, right? That's not my view of the world. Yes, I don't like criminals, but I think it's worse if honest people have to go to jail. So yes, some people might get away with a crime. Okay, I'm willing to accept that for the bigger picture. And if taxes are too oppressive, then people are going to want to evade them. How about if we just have a more fair, honest tax system where you don't have as many people try not to pay? That is the solution. Have a more fair, more honest system. And if the government can't enforce the taxes without violating our constitutional rights, then there's something wrong with the tax system. They have to change the tax system. They don't get rid of our constitutional rights. They say, oh, wait a minute, maybe this tax system is the problem. Let's have a tax system that is consistent with the Constitution, right? Let's collect taxes and protect constitutional rights at the same time. let's not get rid of the Constitution so we can enforce an inherently oppressive tax system. Because I think the current tax system in the U.S. is not really in harmony with the Constitution. That's the problem. We're raising taxes in ways that the founding fathers specifically wrote the Constitution to prevent. That's why there's this inherent conflict right now between the way they're trying to enforce taxes and the Constitution, because they're inconsistent. They're not compatible with one another. And I think it's the Constitution that should survive, not our tax system. I'd like to see the tax system, changed and the Constitution preserved.
I want to ask you maybe one more question about artificial intelligence. It's a super growing trend. Is it a big threat or is it an opportunity? A lot of people are scared of losing their jobs. Some people are saying that there's a lot of money to be made with AI. What are your views about that?
Well, whenever there's a technological improvement, people are afraid of losing jobs. It's a labor-saving device, right? That's what all machines are, technology. It's about greater efficiency. So whenever you improve efficiency, by definition, you reduce the amount of work that humans have to perform. You can, look at, like earth-moving equipment, like, for excavation, or, even a shovel, right? A shovel, before people had shovels, I guess they dug with their bare hands. So somebody invented a shovel, and now you didn't need as many people to dig. So what happened to all those diggers that lost their jobs? Because now one person can do the digging of 10 because they had a shovel, right? Well, they did something else. They didn't have to dig anymore. They got freed up, right? So AI has the potential to free up a tremendous amount of labor, because humans won't be required to perform tasks that can now be done by an artificial intelligence. And so what does that mean? That means that whatever those humans collectively used to help produce can now be produced with far fewer resources. And that means at a much lower cost. And that means the price comes down and the supply goes up for whatever was being created. And that benefits everybody. Right? The whole goal of an economy is to replace scarcity with abundance, because everything is scarce in nature. And so we're trying to create abundance. We're trying to create goods and services that people can consume and enjoy a higher standard of living. Well, the fewer resources that need to be consumed in the production of those goods and services, the more goods and services we're going to have, because there is a limit to the resources at our disposal. But ever since we've had maybe even the Industrial Revolution was a bigger springboard for that. But there's always people that lose their jobs, right? The automobile gets invented. Well, the buggy whip manufacturer loses his job because we don't need as many buggy whips, because people aren't riding around on horses. They have a horseless carriage, and so there's always the old that dies off, and then you have a birth of something new. And so I there's nothing different about people thinking, oh, I'm going to lose my job to AI, right? Yes, a lot of people will lose their jobs, but new jobs will replace. Now, obviously, ultimately, too, the goal of society should be to eliminate all jobs, so nobody has to work, right? Everything gets done, right? And then we just have a life of leisure, right? It's because work for most people is not an ends; it's a means to an end. I work because I need food, because I need shelter, because I need clothing. Well, what if I don't need any of those things anymore? What if AI just provides me with all those things? Well, then I don't have to work, right? So, eliminating work is a positive, right? The danger that I think people perceive from AI, from what I could tell, is that AI may be a threat to humanity, in that it may destroy humanity. That's what people are concerned about, that AI may decide that we're expendable because I think the analogy is like, well, if you wanted to build something, a structure,
and you noticed there were some ants, around, would you care? That you were going to kill these ants while you were erecting this new structure? Would you take some time? We have to relocate these ants. No, you wouldn't care. You would just build whatever you build, and the ants were just an acceptable casualty, because what do you care? They're a bunch of ants, right? So if, when it comes to artificial intelligence, we're the equivalent of an ant, that it's so much more intelligent than we are, that human life means absolutely nothing to AI. And if the AI, for whatever reason, decides it wants to do something, and as a consequence it wipes out humanity, it might not care. Now, I don't know that, I got a lot of other things to worry about other than AI wiping me out. I mean, I think it's more likely that it's a benefit, that it's more likely that it will, this tool will significantly bring forward scientific advancement. Things may be discovered a lot sooner as a result of the ability of AI to do things that humans couldn't do. That we've invented a tool that very much advances our ability to solve problems and figure out more efficient ways of producing things, fighting off diseases, curing diseases. I mean, maybe figuring out why we age and how to maybe stop the process. I'm 60, so I'm
60 this year. I heard
I've aged enough. I'd like to stop. I'd like to stop this process. I'd like to reverse this process. So maybe AI could do that. So I'm more optimistic, about it than fearful that it's going to, kill me and everybody else. So we'll see. But I don't think, that it's a get out of jail free card for governments, that, this is going to allow enough increased productivity that we're not going to have to deal with the problems of the debt. I think it will help lessen the severity of the crisis, because of it. But, the government may end up erecting a lot of roadblocks that prevent AI from delivering its full potential. And of course, in the short run, if people are displaced from jobs, it could end up being inflationary, more welfare, more unemployment, more money printing. And there may be barriers that prevent people from finding other employment that they might otherwise have been able to find, but for those government barriers.
Thank you so much, Peter, and safe trip back home.
All right, thanks a lot. Hi, this is Peter Schiff, and you're watching Think Smart Education.